Who can you work for or who can you represent with your license? That's going to be the topic of discussion in this presentation, and it's part of a two-part presentation. This is obviously part one, and we're going to be talking about who can you work for. In part two, we're going to be discussing what can you deal with, what sort of property can you deal with, and items and so forth. So who can you work for, who can you represent? And I'm using the phrase license, with your license, meaning your class 1 or your class 2 or your assistant agent. And I'm using that terminology purposefully because it means in this context that you're class 1 or class 2 or you're an assistant agent under the correct supervision of a class 1 or class 2. So the relationship, the basic relationship in agency practice is agent and principal. A for agent, P for principal. The word principal I'm going to be using in this instance is not the person who owns the office. It's not the boss. People often say, can I introduce you to my principal? His name is John Smith. He owns the business. That is indeed one of the usages of the word principal, certainly in real estate, but it's not the use we're going to be making in this instance. Principal in this discussion means the entity or the person to whom you owe a fiduciary duty, the entity or person who's going to pay you for your services. That person or entity is your principal. And the letter C represents the contractual duties between agent and principal and the obligation of the principal to pay you or to reimburse your expenses, or both. So F is for fiduciary duties, C is for contractual obligations and rights, P principal, and A for agent. So we all know, because we've been around the industry at least for some time, even if we're new to the industry, we've heard about people talking about real estate. So it's common to understand that agents can work to sell properties. That's a fairly common understanding. If I introduce myself as a real estate agent, people will assume, oh, he or she sells properties for people. Yep. And by the same token, people understand quite commonly that I could be managing someone's property. I'm a property manager, let's say. So I could be working for a vendor, a seller. I could be working for a landlord. And that is a fairly common pairing. So the typical person or the typical observer who's looking into the industry would see real estate agents help people sell properties and help owners manage properties. That's a fairly common one. Not to say that you have to do both, by the way. Increasingly, we have people specializing only in sales or only in property management, even though they can do a lot more. Okay? We also have real estate agents, certainly of late. There's been a renaissance, if you wish, in the buyer's agency category. So if you're an agent, a real estate agent, you can also work for buyers of property, purchasers of property. So let's put that down there as well. So I can work for sellers, I can work for landlords, I can work for buyers, and I can even, and this is perhaps the most novel of the categories, I can even work for tenants. Now, I personally get a lot of requests to assist tenants. They're not typically residential tenants because of the Residential Tenancies Act and the New South Wales Civil and Admin Tribunal, and together the Act and the Tribunal do look after the interests of residential tenants' interests very well, comprehensively. So the area of representation or advocacy work that you could be involved in as an agent would more than likely be commercial or, broadly speaking, non-residential tenants. Now, as I said before, it's normally the fact that the selling of and the managing of property goes together. That's a fairly common coupling. My experience is that buyer's agency tends to be separate, and I'll come back to that in a second. And obviously this fairly newish category, I mean, it's always been available, obviously, but people are now really starting to offer those services. And it's typically come about recently because of COVID. There have been commercial tenants who've entered into leases, who've entered into difficult times, and they now need some help representing their interests against the landlord, because the landlord typically has got solicitors and agents working for them, the big end of town, not always, but frequently. And so it's the tenant who needs some help. So there is definitely an emerging market there. But even though you can buy, sell, manage, and tenant advocate as an agent, you have the capacity to do all of that. You clearly cannot do it if there's a conflict of interest. Be very careful about that. I'm saying that you have the capacity to buy, sell, manage, and advocate, but you certainly can't do it all at the same time on the same property. In particular, the ones that I will single out for comment is you certainly cannot help somebody buy a property and help them sell the same property. In other words, you cannot be acting for a vendor on a particular property as well as a purchaser. That is, in fact, a conversation we've had in a previous presentation, but let me make the point again, right? It's illegal to act for the seller of a particular property as well as the purchaser of that particular property. You can act for a vendor selling property A at the same time as acting for a buyer on property B, no problem. And the same thing would obviously be in respect of managing a property and being a tenant advocate. You obviously cannot do that on the same property either for obvious reasons to do with the conflict of interest. Now, the last category that you can you can act for, or principle that you can act for, is going to be an owner's corporation. But you will need a separate license if you want to act for an owner's corporation, that license being a strata manager's license. So I've grouped them. Real estate and stock and station agents would be, although they are obviously separate licenses, they have a degree of convergence, and you can certainly help somebody buy, sell, manage, and you can tenant advocate with those licenses. If you want to act for an owner's corporation, you will need a separate license, and we use the phrase represent. A strata manager represents an owner's corporation by virtue of the delegation that they receive from the owner's corporation. And their functions are therefore determined or limited by whatever delegation the owner's corporation has given to the strata manager. So, just to summarize then, agents act for principals. The principals who they can act for will vary depending on what license you have and what role you choose to take. It's very common for real estate agents to act for vendors and landlords. Those same real estate agents can also act for purchasers, and they can also act for tenants in certain circumstances as long as they avoid a conflict of interest. The overlap between real estate agents and stock and station agents in this discussion is very significant. Obviously, there's a difference between a stock and station agent and a real estate agent in terms of what can they deal with, but in terms of who can they represent, it's a very similar outcome. And remember, strata managers, separate license, they will represent an owner's corporation under the delegation that they receive. My name is Craig Swan. I hope that has been useful information for you. I would always appreciate your feedback and comments if you care to give them. You can reach me through Instagram at Craig_Leverage Group. You could also reach me through email, Craig Swan, SWAN, at leveragegroup.com.au. I wish you the very best with your endeavors in the world of agency. And as usual, happy hunting.